Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this workshop series on childhood neurodiversity. My name is Sarah St. Ledger, and I'm a psychologist in the Psychology in Schools team, and I'm joined by my colleagues, Linda. Linda, did you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, hi, I'm Linda Brindle. I'm a senior psychologist also within the Psychology in Schools team, which is part of the Children's Mental Health Services in Suffolk.
Thanks, Linda and Zoe.
Hi, I'm Zoe Buckle. I'm an assistant psychologist in the Psychology in Schools team.
Great, thank you guys. So today's workshop is focusing on supporting your child in education, and it's been co-produced with experts by lived experience and those with expertise in this area, such as the specialist provision teachers, the psychology and therapeutic services, and the mental health support teams. And we really hope that this workshop will give you an understanding of how you can better support your child to access education and the systems out there which might be able to help. And we acknowledge that a lot of neurodiverse young people might be attending alternative provision. And although this is something that the workshop will touch on, the focus is predominantly on the support available within education settings locally. And I guess I just wanted to highlight that there's an awful lot of information here we're going to be talking about, and some bits of that information will feel more pertinent to you than other parts. Everyone here is likely to be at different stages in their journey in supporting their child. And as Linda has already said, you will receive a recording of the workshop. And a copy of the slides, as well as a resource pack. So don't feel like you have to try and take everything in. Instead, we recommend that you just jot down the things that feel relevant to you and your child, and then you can follow those up later. Okay, so just to help give some context to today's workshop as well, everyone on the local NDD wait list were invited to complete a survey, and this workshop was developed in response to that, in consultation with a range of relevant services. As many of you said, that education can be an area that feels really tricky to navigate. So thank you for sharing your feedback with us, and we hope that you find this helpful. The broad sort of areas that we're going to cover today are what are special educational needs, and we're going to look at some of the key legislation which defines this. We're going to look at what support is available in education settings for neurodivergent children, and we're going to be sharing some really nice supportive documents which have been recently published on how mainstream provision should be supporting young people. We're going to look at some of the challenges education might be bringing for your child and how that might be feeling as parents or carers. And we're going to look at some helpful tips around how to support good communication with an education setting. And we're also going to be signposting to some further support and resources which you might find helpful. And I guess one service we will be making reference to is Suffolk Sendias. And for people that don't know what that is, they are the Special Educational Needs and Disability Information, Advice and Support Service. That's a bit of a mouthful. And that's a confidential and impartial information, advice and support service on issues relating to special educational needs and disability, and they're free, they're easy to access, and they're confidential. And we've got some links to their website at various points throughout our presentation. Okay, so we're just going to start by looking at what are special educational needs. So special educational needs is a term used for when a child requires additional support, which is different to the needs and support given to their same age peers. So in education settings, most young people's needs are met using whole school or whole classroom interventions. And these are adaptations that teachers might make for all students in their classroom. For example, breaking down the information into chunks. Now, young people with special educational needs will need further adaptation to meet their needs, and these will be different for each child. So, for example, one child with dyslexia might have their needs met by a teacher using different coloured slides in a PowerPoint presentation, whilst another young person with dyslexia might require a reading pen in class. And the SEND code of practice that you can see on the slide outlines that a medical diagnosis is not required for a young person to be recognised as having a special education need. And we know that a lot of parents have felt that not having a diagnosis has felt like a barrier to accessing support in education settings. And I guess we just wanted to reassure you that every education setting should endeavour to make sure young people with special education needs get the support that they need, irrespective of whether they have a diagnosis or not. And this section of the SEND Code of Practice does highlight that. Education settings must legally display their SEN information report on their website. And this offers information on complaints procedures, on SEN support in school, the training staff members have and the interventions that they can offer, how young people with special educational needs are supported to take part in activities, the curriculum and environmental adaptations, how they assess and review student progress, and who the SENCO is. And each school will have a SENCO, which is a special education needs coordinator. And if you are wondering about whether your child has a special education need, it can be really helpful just to ask your school if your young person is on their SEN radar. So, education services put SEN into 4 broad areas of need. And the table on the slide isn't comprehensive, but it's just to give you an idea of the different types of special education needs. So we've got communication and interaction. So a child might need additional support in this area if they have persistent needs in expressive language, receptive language, social communication and interaction, flexibility in thought and behaviour, executive functioning difficulties, emotional regulation difficulties, despite having reasonable adjustments and support in place. So, for example, speech and language needs, situational mutism, which is also known as selective mutism, or dysgraphia would all come under this area. And we know that, for example, autistic children in particular are likely to have more communication and interaction need, and ADHD can also present a need in this area. So then we've got cognition and learning, and this is when a child learns at a significantly slower pace than their age-matched peers, even when appropriate differentiation, reasonable adjustments, and appropriate scaffolding are in place. And children in this area might have a specific learning difficulty, as mentioned in the slide, or they may also have profound and multiple learning difficulties. So then we have the social, emotional, and mental health area. And young people who fit into this category might have difficulty managing their emotions and their behaviour, building and maintaining relationship with peers and other adults. Some examples might include anxiety, depression, eating disorders like ARFID and binge eating. And then finally, we've got our sensory and physical needs. And this refers to multi-sensory impairment. So things like hearing loss, visual impairment, or a physical disability. And it's a common misconception that sensory differences fit within this broad area of need, when in actuality, sensory differences might fall under any of these broad areas of need. So, for example, your young person might be distressed by loud noises or by busy places, and that might be considered a social and emotional need. And it's important to note that for all of these areas of need, adjustments and support should be provided according to the needs of the child and young person, irrespective of a formal diagnosis. Your child might not fit neatly into one of these categories, and they might have a combination of needs from different areas, or you might feel like your young person has a high need in just one of these areas. And I guess we just wanted to sort of recognise that all children with special educational needs will present differently. Okay, so we're just going to move on now to look at a bit about what support is available in education. So we know that all of you who have been invited to attend today are currently waiting for screening for consideration of assessment for either autism, ADHD, or both for your child or young person. And we hear regularly that parents feel an immense pressure to receive a diagnosis so that they can finally access the right support for their child. And whilst a diagnosis might inform the underlying needs and help give education professionals an idea of the support required, as we mentioned in the initial workshop, a lot of support in education should be available irrespective of a formal diagnosis. It should be individual and based on needs rather than diagnosis-led. As you know, two autistic children likely have completely different needs, and likewise, two children with ADHD might present completely differently. So it's really a needs-led approach. And on this slide, there's an image of a really nice, important new document that we thought that you'd want to know about if you don't already. And it's called the Suffolk Mainstream Inclusion Framework. And it was just published this September. And it outlines the best practice for supporting children and young people, including those with special educational needs and disabilities, in mainstream education settings. And it outlines the ordinarily available provision, which is expected within mainstream schools, based on the principles of quality first teaching. The document also identifies a range of non-negotiable menus of classroom support that mainstream settings should be providing. There is a menu for each broad area of need that I described in the slide earlier. And some of the support offered in these menus includes having access to a quiet, distraction-free place, the pupil's voice being central, celebrating pupil successes, building on strengths, and use of sensory resources. So, for example, if your young person has a communication and interaction need, they should have access to signing, gestures, pictures to facilitate understanding of spoken language. They should be given additional time to process language, opportunities to develop speaking and listening skills. And for social and emotional needs, it should be considered how the pupil's voice can be collected. So, for example, drawing and talking to a trusted adult, having identified safe spaces, and additional appropriate adult support. And in this document, there are pages and pages of support listed, some of which is universal, meaning that all children should have access to this support if needed, and other menus are more bespoke. And it can be really helpful to familiarise yourself with the support available, and there's a link to that document on the slide. And if that feels too difficult to manage or too overwhelming, you could highlight this document to your SENCO in your child's school to help them identify suitable adjustments for your child, or speak to SENDIAS to get impartial advice. So, having seen the inclusion framework, we're just going to have a look at the graduated approach to SEND support. And this is the starting place if your child has needs that aren't being supported in a classroom setting. It aims to identify the child's needs and remove any potential barriers to their learning. It's a 4-stage process which schools should be doing, and it includes the first stage, which is to assess. And this is where key staff will build a picture of the needs of your child through observations, attainment levels, and recent assessment outcomes. The second stage is the plan. So here, schools and parents will work together to create a time-limited plan of support for your child. And this may include whole class interventions like chunking information, creating inclusive classroom environment and differentiated teaching for your young person. And then there's the third area, which is the do. And here, education settings then implement the agreed adjustments, interventions, and support with the support of the SENCO. And the fourth part is the review. So this is where they'll check if the support now in place is helpful and make any necessary amendments to it. And there is an expectation outlined in the SEND Code of Practice that the parent and child should be involved in 3 stages of this process: the assess, the plan, and the review. And this is to ensure that you can collaboratively explore and agree a plan of support which is bespoke to your child's needs. We'll talk a little bit more later on about person-centered planning and how your young person's views can be captured. So just to overview, this is the first type of support if your child is making less than the expected progress despite having at least 2 rounds of evidence-based support and interventions in place, then further support might be needed. And we've included a really helpful link to a clip from SENDIAS at the bottom of this slide, and this video explains SEND support that should be available in schools and the graduated response cycle in more depth if you're interested. And before support can be accessed, as outlined in the Children's and Families Act 2014, there must have been at least 2 cycles of intervention or be a medical diagnosis in place. And we appreciate that you are waiting for potential diagnoses for your children. So this might have been something that you found challenging while trying to access support for your young person. So we're just going to have a little look at reasonable adjustments. And as this slide states, reasonable adjustments are adjustments that a service must make if someone's physical or mental disability places them at a disadvantage. So, for example, where a subject that is usually taught upstairs is instead taught downstairs to enable a pupil in a wheelchair to access the lesson. Or where a student with sensory needs eating in a quieter room with a small group of friends instead of a busy canteen. So this could be things like start time flexibility, uniform flexibility, accessing the curriculum differently, and supportive resources. And education provisions must consider what reasonable adjustments can be made to avoid your child being at a disadvantage to their peers. So if you feel that your child requires reasonable adjustments, then we advise that you speak to your provisions SENCO. And it's a common misconception that you need an EHC plan to have reasonable adjustments, and that's not the case. And although your young person might meet the criteria for a disability under the Equality Act, and many young people with SEND do meet this criteria, there's a really helpful video clip from SENDIAS outlining what disability is under the Equality Act if you're unsure, and the link is just there on the slide. So we've just got another Slido here, and we'd be really interested in hearing what adjustments your child or children have found helpful. Okay. Movement breaks, vigils, timers, check-ins, using a computer to type, having work written down in front of him so he can remember what he's doing, sitting at the front, lunch club, movement breaks, eating separately and outside, orange paper. So again, those sort of, breaks, visual cues, fidget toys, really helpful. Having the blinds shut so he doesn't get distracted looking outside. Being able to wear earphones. Reminders to stay on task. Extra support sessions on subjects that they're finding difficult.
I'm just wondering what the voice detect is, and I'm not familiar with that. And I was wondering if the person that's written that also just wants to explain what that is as well, so everyone in the room can understand it. It might just be us that aren't familiar, but it'd be useful to know.
Got nurture interventions.
And I'm hearing that's hard if you feel like actually a school's response is not responsive and supportive. That's very tough as a parent if you've been told that actually they're not really thinking about adjustments. And I hope that what Sarah's been talking about today will give you some sort of strong sort of guidance to help schools to recognise they do need to consider these adjustments, although we do know that they can also be very busy and overwhelmed as well.
Added time, movement breaks. Scribe. I think this might answer your question, Linda. It might be voice to text for dyslexia. They couldn't read his writing, so didn't know if he had an understanding of the topic. I don't know.
Thanks, that sounds really helpful. So I guess it's really seeing that with technology sort of developing, that there are some more adaptive ways of supporting children with their learning and communicating. That's really helpful to hear. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, everybody. Oh, someone's still typing. And I guess with all of these things, I guess we're thinking about the sort of balance of adjustments necessary for your child, but whilst also building their ability to cope over time and prepare them for greater independence and to prepare that sort of increase their ability to tolerate things around in the world around them. There's some great new sort of tech things, aren't they, in here as well? Okay, lovely. Thanks everybody for that. That's really helpful to see. And I'm sure it's given other parents lots of useful ideas. So we're just going to have a little look at access arrangements. So access arrangements are adjustments for students based on evidence need. So examples of adjustment arrangements include using a reading pen or having a reader, having a scribe. So some of the things that parents were talking about in the Slido, rest breaks, extra time, or use of coloured paper. An access arrangement should reflect the young person's normal way of working. So settings must evidence a need for the adjustment, which demonstrates that this is their normal way of working. So, for example, it might be that a young person requires regular rest breaks within their lessons, and this would be evidence that they would also require similar support in an exam. Or that a young person uses a laptop within their lessons, which evidences that they would need one if they were to have an exam. And education settings can decide on some adjustments. So, for example, rest breaks, but some access arrangements do require an application by a published deadline. For example, a writing speed test. And assessors for some of these things must hold appropriate teaching qualifications or be a HCPC psychologist and be familiar with the Equality Act 2010 and the JCQ reasonable adjustments and principles. And because of these things, it can be really helpful to think well in advance. So in the autumn term, as requests need to be made in the spring term quite often. Most adjustments follow what happens in class. So, for example, if a young person uses a laptop consistently in a classroom or a reading pen, this would usually be reflected in their exams also. And there are different deadlines depending on when exams are being taken. So some exams, like the EdExcel functional skills, take place in January, and access arrangements for those are, we've passed those now, so they were back in October. For summer 2025 exams, the deadline for modified papers is the 31st of January. And the deadline for other access arrangements, which need to be formally requested, is the 21st of March. And it's important, I guess, to highlight that not all access arrangements need to be formally requested via the Joint Council for Qualifications, including some arrangements such as supervised rest breaks, which are particularly helpful for families of children with special educational needs. And while some access arrangements do require formal testing, not all do. And it can be really helpful to think ahead as schools have to apply in advance of their published deadlines. So if your young person is going for their exams in June 2025, the deadline is the 31st of January for schools to apply for modified papers, and the 21st of March for some access arrangements. So really important to check in with your education setting about which access requirements or arrangements require formal testing, and be really curious with the about the support your young person might need in their exams, and discuss it with your SENCO. And we've also included a link to the SENDIAS page on access arrangements if you wanted more information around this. And SENDIAS are able to unpick this and offer more support if needed. So we're just going to talk a little bit now about special education services. So most young people's needs can be met through whole school approaches and interventions. However, if you feel like your young person isn't having their needs met after trying the things already discussed, then it might be time for the school to reach out to special educational services. Schools can have inclusion support meetings with the special education services, which are usually 30-minute online appointments where the SES where they offer general advice, and you can ask school if they've already requested this. And there are also 5 special educational service teams in Suffolk, each based on a different broad area of need listed on the slide. And you can click on each one to find out more information about their offer and consider which feels most relevant to you and your family. And remember, you are the expert of your child, so it can be helpful to share with the school if you feel your child is particularly struggling in one of these areas. This process can also support an EHC needs assessment if this is something that your child needs. So the psychology and therapeutic services are a team of educational psychologists, assistant psychologists and inclusion facilitators based in Suffolk. They might offer support into schools, to families and young people at any point of the graded response cycle. So with the assessing, the planning, the doing and the reviewing. They offer a variety of input from various forms, from consultation offers and specialist training to school staff, to completing sensory profiling with a student. They offer functional behavioural analysis, and they use a variety of psychological based tools to help support a child to progress in school. And it's school staff such as the SENCO who can request their support via a referral. So if your young person has been making less than expected progress, despite having evidence-based support and intervention, it could also be helpful to ask your SENCO to seek support from the psychology and therapeutic services. So just some examples. So schools can request solution circles, which are forums where solution-focused discussions are held to consider how a child's needs are best met following a problem that has arisen in school. Schools may request an analysis of additional needs tool, which uses a video consultation process between an educational psychologist and an adult from the education setting who knows the learner well. The outcome is a personalised action plan for the young person, which aims to have a better understanding of the young person's needs and how to promote the learner's strengths and consider effective ways to support learning needs. And it is worth noting that there is a cost for the schools for an ANT to take place. And moreover, as you will, as parents and carers, will have to give permission for an ANT to take place and to share your views as well as part of the process. There's also the Inclusion Facilitation Service, which is a team within the broader psychology and therapeutic services, and it aims to empower children and young people across Suffolk by promoting greater inclusion within educational settings. They'll help with the implementation of plans in practice, and they can be involved in promoting and facilitating collaborative working between school and parents if this is challenging. And this team is also accessible through the SENCO, and it doesn't require an EHCP. So if you wanted to learn more about either the Suffolk Inclusion Facilitation Services or the psychology and therapeutic services, you can click on the videos in this slide. So if after using the above support, there are still a lot of concerns around your child needing further support, they may then require an education, health and care assessment. An EHC needs assessment is a formal process of gathering information about the barriers to learning for your young person, and it's the first step towards potentially having an EHC plan. An EHC plan is a legal document written by the local authority, which is used to support children with the most complex needs in education settings. It describes the young person's needs and adjustments, short-term and long-term goals for education. And whilst the special education services are not an essential prerequisite before requesting an EHC needs assessment, the service can provide really helpful support, which may mean that an EHCP is not needed. Equally, it can provide evidence that your young person does meet the threshold for an EHCP process to commence. And I guess there were a few myths around education, health and care plans that we wanted to just dispel. So an EHC needs assessment, it's often thought that that will bring more funding, and they don't. So schools can apply to higher needs funding in Suffolk with or without an EHCP. So there's not a requirement for that for the school to gain funding. There's also a myth that you need to have a medical diagnosis to apply for an EHCP. You don't, but interventions do need to have been put into place first, and that's at least 2 cycles of intervention. And section 36 of the Children's and Families Act 2014 states that the local authority must secure an EHC needs assessment for the child or young person if, after having regard to any views expressed and evidence submitted under the subsection 7, the authority is of the opinion that A, the child or young person has or may have special education needs, and B, it may be necessary for special education provision to be made for the child or young person in accordance with an EHCP plan. There's often a myth that you need an EHCP to have reasonable adjustments or access arrangements. And as I mentioned earlier, the recent guidance around inclusion support that schools must offer means that no EHCP is needed for reasonable adjustments and access arrangements. And there's a little visual here on the slide which gives a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the EHC process. So it begins with either the parent or school applying for an EHC needs assessment, and then within 6 weeks, the local authority must inform you whether they will carry out an EHC needs assessment. And if the assessment and plan is agreed, it should be approximately 20 weeks between the assessment request and the EHCP being issued. And if you'd like more information on the EHC needs, CENDIAS have some great videos explaining the threshold for EHCPs and how to request them.
Amazing. Thank you, Sarah. So, I'm just going to talk through now some of the challenges that education may bring for neurodivergent children. Okay, so we worked with Participate, which is a group of young people who share their lived experiences. So a massive thank you to them. We have a quote on the slide here, which you're able to read through. And this is a neurodivergent young person who is speaking about some of their challenges in education. So saying that they found that they had some challenges in social relationships in school, and kind of they noticed that they had different interests to other peers in their school, and that could sometimes leave them with a feeling of frustration and also a feeling of wondering what is wrong with them. So it sounds like for this young person, kind of noticing some differences from their peers felt a little bit frustrating for them in education. And we're also going to have a listen to a young person, and this young person has verbal tics. So you'll hear these verbal tics in the recording, and the verbal tic that's being used is ABC. And this young person is autistic. And they've shared a little bit about some of their challenges in social relationships during school and reflecting on how this may relate to their autistic traits. So I encourage you to have a listen to the young person. Perhaps if you're neurodivergent yourself, maybe think about whether you shared any similar experiences and just consider what this experience might be like for this young person. So, Linda, if you wouldn't mind playing from 3 minutes and 8 seconds, if you can find it along there. Thank you so much.
A bit like obviously an outsider, even though I considered them my friends, and I think I realise now that that was maybe obviously because of the way I was at school, the way I approached, task, and how seriously obviously I took school, and I think, and when I got older, it got obviously easier for me to um manage that, and also the teachers got to understand me better as time went
Amazing,
on,
thank you, Linda.
and so
So hopefully that just gives you a little bit of an insight there into, for this young person, one of the challenges that they experienced of actually kind of noticing differences in an education setting, and how this at times did make them feel like a little bit of an outsider. So a massive thank you to Participate for sharing their experience. Now, of course, this is just one young person who is autistic sharing their experience. And we acknowledge that for all neurodivergent young people, they're going to have different experiences. So that's just one example that your young person may or may not relate to. So I guess we're wondering if you'd be able to share some challenges that education may be bringing to your child. So when we developed this workshop, we asked parents kind of what areas feel tricky, and education came up quite a lot for parents, and it felt like an area where maybe you were feeling a little bit stuck. So I suppose I'm wondering, what brought you here today? What challenges has your young person shared, or perhaps your school or education setting, if your young person is in one, has noticed. Yes, results in low self-esteem as he feels stupid in his words, making friends, handwriting, anxiety in speaking up when something feels uncomfortable, doesn't want to appear rude. Yes, so maybe some difficulty advocating for themselves. Anxiety in school, yes, we know this is often more common in neurodivergent children. Doesn't want to stand out. School not meeting needs. Yes, schools can feel like a really tricky environment if needs aren't being met. Won't ask for help. Controlling emotions, misunderstanding and mishearing. So many distractions. Oh, yeah, schools are just, there's so much going on, isn't there? That can feel really overwhelming. Child with ARFID, food tech lessons, very difficult to partake in, yes. Doesn't find anything fun. Negative thinking. Under-resourced, complete exhaustion, masking all day. Yes, we're going to talk a little bit to masking. Friendship struggles, smells from kitchen. Yeah, so some sensory differences. Changes to routine, distracted all the time. Yeah. So it sounds like there are a lot of challenges that are going on for your young person. School clothing doesn't feel right. SATs practice causing upset and refusal, yeah. Left on their own, wandering around. Worrying how he'll pass exams, yeah, so a lot of exam anxiety. Okay, so I guess we're wondering, thank you for sharing those challenges firstly, but I suppose we're wondering, how do these challenges make you feel as a parent? Helpless, angry, lost, frustrated. And it's worth saying that the more a word is put by multiple people, it grows. So that may give you a sense of how your experiences are being shared by other parents as well. So it seems like overall there's a big feeling of helplessness, which I can imagine it feels really tricky when obviously you want the best for your young person and it can sometimes feel difficult getting some of this support into place. Sad, worried, stressed, and frustrated, powerless, feeling like a failure, feeling inadequate. And I suppose it's reflecting on what do these feelings tell you? Well, these feelings tell you that you really care for your young person. You really want the best for your young person. Tired of fighting for support? Yes. Exhausted. Thank you so much for sharing some of your feelings on some of those challenges. Okay, so on the next slide, um, we just wanted to share a quote with you. And this is a quote from a parent of a neurodivergent child from one of the events we hosted to learn a little bit more about kind of the experiences in education. And this parent shared that schools say it's the GP and the GP say it's the school. And it's just like our children are a hot potato, that no one ever wants to look at them holistically or to support them in the best way. And we wanted to share this, I suppose, because we really wanted to acknowledge that feeling of frustration that a lot of you as parents may relate to or may be experiencing. I know a lot of you kind of shared that on the previous Slido, and actually how frustrating it can feel when your young person is experiencing some of these challenges and feeling like they're not getting the right support. So I'm hoping today through this workshop, by talking to some of the support that's available, it can give you some resources and knowledge to go away and to work with school, if your young person is in an education setting, to kind of start getting those supports in place for your young person. Okay. So thank you for sharing your challenges with us today via Slido. Let's think together about some of the challenges your young person may be experiencing and why that may happen for neurodivergent children. So, executive functioning differences. So there's substantial evidence that neurodivergent people are more likely to have differences with executive functioning. So both ADHD and autism are associated with similar differences, particularly with attention, particularly in ADHD, flexibility, so of thinking, flexibility of behavior, so maybe engaging in routines and engaging in rituals might be something your young person does. Working memory differences, so it might be kind of difficulty keeping information in mind, or perhaps your young person has a special interest which they have an amazing memory for, but if it's something that they're less interested in, they find that a bit more difficult. Processing speed, so kind of processing information at a slower pace. Response inhibition, so it can be harder to control some impulses. And what does this look like in a classroom setting? So students might require a bit of additional time to process verbal or written instructions. They might find disruption to routine tricky. Perhaps if there's a sudden change in the teacher, that could kind of create some emotional dysregulation. They might find it difficult taking turns, or they may seem forgetful in class. Then we've got emotion-based school avoidance and difficulty attending school, and also school refusal. So some children will have difficulty attending school for practical reasons, maybe around transport or accessibility, but some children may refuse school because they'd rather do something else. And that might be something you may relate to with your young person. However, a lot of children avoid school for emotion-based reasons. And this is called emotion-based school avoidance. And this is where an emotion-based challenge is driving the avoidance. So examples of this could be perhaps a child is feeling really anxious, maybe due to bullying at school, or maybe they're struggling to keep up in their lessons because they've not got that support in place to help them to learn, or perhaps they don't feel safe in a school environment. And this could all lead to school avoidance. Sensory differences. So many neurodivergent children experience sensory sensitivities, so differences in sensitivity to sensory stimuli. You shared some of these on Slidos. Schools are really overwhelming and busy places. Loud noises may make the canteen feel really overwhelming, or busy corridors, perhaps going into the PE changing room and there are lots of smells going on and it can all feel really overstimulating. And I suppose mentalizing this for your young person, if they have sensory differences, what might that be like being in a school setting? Emotion dysregulation. So having lots of big feelings, maybe anger, maybe feelings of anxiety, which some of you shared in your Slidos, and finding it tricky to manage those big feelings. Often there'll be a build-up of these emotions throughout the day. Going to school with sensory differences, there might be lots of triggers in the environment that feel overwhelming, those busy corridors again. Sort of sitting in a classroom with executive functioning differences, environmental factors, and all of these start to make the emotions build up. And usually there's a final trigger which can make these emotions feel really overwhelming and lead to emotional dysregulation. And we know that schools vary a lot in how well they're able to support children to regulate emotions. And we know that if adjustments aren't in place to help a young person to regulate, that this dysregulation will become more common. Okay. Then we've got difficulties in social relationships. So we spoke to these in some of the examples shared by Participate, and we also spoke to these in some of our previous neurodiversity workshops. So we did one last month, which you'll be able to access a recording of in the resource pack if you're interested. So we know that social communication differences between neurodivergent and neurotypical children can make social relationships a little bit tricky. So a neurodivergent child might miss social cues or miss nuances in another student's communication that help them to make sense of their behaviour, or may struggle to consider something from another student's perspective. Whilst equally, a neurotypical classmate might not recognise or understand neurodivergence, and they might be unclear in their meaning or in their intention. And this double empathy problem can sometimes get in the way of forming mutual relationships. And unfortunately, we do know that young people who are neurodiverse are more vulnerable to bullying. And we spoke to social vulnerability in our previous workshop on supporting social relationships and being curious about your young person's social relationships if you're interested. Anxiety. So we know that neurodivergent children are more vulnerable to experiencing anxiety. And again, we have a workshop next month upcoming, which is going to explore these differences in more depth. So if this is an area that feels particularly challenging for your young person, you can register to this using the link at the end of the workshop. And then we've also got exam stress, which again was mentioned. Which I think holding in mind kind of having this heightened anxiety potentially, having executive function differences, when also pairing that with narrow neurotypical definitions of success. So in schools, often success is measured by how well did your young person do on a test. And all of these pressures can make exams feel really, really stressful, and particularly stressful for neurodivergent children. So it's important to hold in mind that these challenges may be related to traits of autism or ADHD, or they may not be. And it's also really important that schools are adapting the environment to support these differences your young person might experience. So we know that often in schools, neurotypical expectations and measures of success can have a negative impact on neurodivergent children's self-esteem. I know someone mentioned this in one of the Slidos. So let's say if a young person with ADHD is struggling to concentrate in class and they fall behind on their work, this could lead to feelings of, I can't do this, I'm not good at this. And this might feel really frustrating for your young person, or could lead to some emotional dysregulation. It's really, really important that schools are supporting your child with executive functioning differences that they might have. Perhaps they may use visual aids, they may break down the information. We're going to speak a little bit more to some of the strategies your young person may find helpful soon. And this is just about enabling your young person to access learning in the best way for them. Just to say, any of the ones on the slide which are underlined, you'll be able to click on and it will take you to a workshop which will explore these in more depth if they're an area important to you. Okay, so now we're just going to think a little bit about masking. It's important to highlight if your young person attends education settings, they may present differently at home and at school. So neurodivergent children may feel pressured to hide their authentic selves, to be accepted by peers, in order to not be criticised or humiliated over their differences. And it is thought in particular that autistic girls tend to mask differences. It's important to acknowledge the emotional impact this can have on a young person. If we think about the concept of a social battery, we all have different levels of social interest. So when a young person is masking, they're using a lot of social energy, and it can feel really draining and have a negative impact on emotional well-being. So we acknowledge that masking in education can lead to needs not being met and identified, and this can feel really frustrating as a parent. As a parent, it can be really helpful to advocate for environments that promote acceptance over conformity. Education settings can support young people who are masking by creating a neuroaffirmative environment for them to learn in, creating a classroom where neurodivergent behaviours like stimming, using assistive devices, avoiding eye contact are accepted and respected, which will reduce the pressure to mask and conceal any differences. So I guess we're wondering, how does your child present differently? And for maybe to have a moment to reflect on that for yourself. Okay, so attendance. Another challenge school may bring to your child is attendance. Schools can be really overwhelming, as we've said, with lots of people and lots of transition. And this can feel tricky to manage, particularly for neurodivergent children. We know a lot of school factors can be associated with school avoidance, for example, bullying, difficulties in subjects, transitions, changes in routine can make the school day feel really overwhelming. We also know that when neurodiverse children's needs are not being met or supported, this can make it harder to attend school. It can be helpful to reflect on how your education setting is supporting your young person and whether this may be connected to attendance. Moreover, is there a representation of neurodiversity within your child's school? By schools being more neuro-affirming spaces, young people are more likely to feel safe and accepted. So, when thinking about what EBSA or emotion-based school avoidance might look like, it might look like withdrawal, crying, avoidance, shouting. Maybe your young person is irritable, maybe they're struggling to communicate or reason. And it can be really helpful to mentalize this for your young person. So we've just got an iceberg here which shows low attendance on the top, and then thinking what might be going on beneath and being curious about this. Could it be friendship fallouts, seeking safety, exam stress? So these are all things that you can have a think about. We did want to speak briefly to school exclusion, just because we know many parents have anxieties around their young person being excluded. And unfortunately, we do know that a disproportionate amount of young people with special educational needs are excluded. I think as a parent, consider your young person's behaviour as communication. So exclusion might be a sign that their needs are not being met by that education setting. And as parents, you can ask school whether further assessment might be needed to identify your child's needs and ask what support is available. It's always okay to ask. We've included a link to Sendias again with more information on school exclusion and a YouTube video which explains how schools can be more inclusive of students with special educational needs. Linda, you're muted.
Didn't unmute there. Thanks ever so much, Zoe. That's really helpful. I'm really aware, everyone here, there's been an awful lot of information that we've been sharing. I guess we felt it's really important to think to help make sure that you understand the basic format of what educational needs, where there's something special going on, what they look like, and understanding the systems in place. And having now spent time with Zoe thinking about the challenges and trying to think about the experiences both for yourself and for your child in the challenges of trying to help your child get the support that they need. The rest of the workshop is time to really think about how you can support them. Clearly, a lot of you have been involved in supporting and trying to get support around adjustments and additional things to help support your child. And we hope that there will be some elements of what I talk about in the last part of this workshop that will be helpful pointers for you in terms of progressing more with getting that support that you would like. So obviously, you've said, some of you, how difficult it is getting the support, and perhaps there's an under-resourced SEN service, one of you mentioned, and others that just feel like perhaps you're not being heard. This slide is really helping us to think a little bit more about ways in which you can advocate for your child. And we know that many of you will be doing a lot of that, or have done a lot of that. And I guess being an advocate is about speaking up for your child with the people that they're around. So with the education staff, it might be highlighting what your child needs to help them to better manage their environment where they are and to help them to learn. And we appreciate it can feel incredibly hard if you feel like you're constantly trying to do this and not always seeing the outcomes that you hope for, and maybe not seeing the changes occurring within the school as quickly as you would like to see them, because you have got your child in mind. And perhaps repeatedly saying the same things again and again can lead to a lot of frustration. And we wanted to really think about what can be helpful. And for this workshop, we spent a lot of time talking with different parts of the system, including school staff, to try and think about what will help them to understand also how they can best support your child. So I hope that you can come to this sort of feeling open, even recognizing perhaps if you've got frustrations, but to hear about maybe something that you might be able to do differently that might create some change in your relationship with school, if that's feeling tricky, or might just bring some other ideas to the table. So one thing that we really wanted to highlight was just thinking about some of the things that you might be communicating with your school, because when we build frustration, perhaps because we don't feel that the school are listening, we can focus very much on just the problems. But actually, we know that if you can help from the start to build up a broader picture for the teaching staff or the support staff about your child, including their strengths and their interests, that can really help those staff to connect a bit more with your child and start to think a little bit more about what's going on for them. It might be mentioning their special interests or their caring qualities, amazing traits or skills, but looking for opportunities to give them a broader sense of your child can be a really helpful thing for their improved understanding about also what your child needs. I guess we know it can be really helpful to acknowledge what the school are trying to do, even if you don't feel that they're doing it in the way that you are finding helpful. So acknowledging what's already in place is really important, just to show that you can see that they're trying, even if it's not feeling like it's quite as you feel it should be. And I guess obviously then once you've acknowledged those things, it's thinking about, is that current support, which I'm sure you're already really aware of, meeting your child's needs, and sensitively thinking about how can we support it to change. I guess what we know is that raising the problems but without identifying solutions often has a less good reception. So if you can try and think creatively about what may be realistic solutions when you are meeting with school to think about where things need to change, that can be really helpful. And trying to do that with speaking first with your child to understand more about their experiences and getting their voice, just as we've talked about earlier in this workshop, can really be the most helpful to ensure that the solutions being identified actually fit with what's going to work for your child. Sharing with the school the things that you find work at home, your approach, the things that can be really helpful. If you can draw on the child's special interest when you're trying to support and motivate them to do something, we know that can be really, really helpful. And on the right of this slide are some really lovely ways in which you can try and communicate in a school in a supportive way. How can I support you to best support my child? So what can I do as a parent that's going to help you feel better able to support my child in school? I've noticed at home that Ellie responds well to. That's quite a nice way of sharing what you know works. In a sort of sensitive way to school. I guess what we know is sometimes when there's a lot of strong emotions in a room, and if there's strong emotions with communication between school and home, sometimes really what we want to achieve gets stuck because strong emotions get in the way. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that in the next slide. But equally, I think we know that parents and carers actually have an absolute right to ask, to understand processes, be really clear about what's going on. The responsibility isn't all with the parent. It's a two-way thing, isn't it? A relationship with school. Finding the best support for your child means if we can keep that communication going, that can be really helpful. But do say, I don't know what you're talking about, or what does this jargon mean? Even on our slides, we know we end up using acronyms for things, which isn't always helpful for people to understand. And there was a lot of information that I was just hearing in this workshop today, thinking that's an awful lot to take in as a parent when it might not be the area which you feel that you know lots about. So I guess when we're thinking about communicating, we know that if you can trying to build that supportive, trusting relationship with those key staff in school, which may often be a Senko, is really important, as it's the best way to help your child get what they need. So when things are feeling tricky and strained, it's obviously both sides of the party's responsibility, but try and see what you can do to try and repair misunderstandings. And actually, the sooner that you address misunderstandings, that can help to repair that relationship with school. And we know often, we've been told a lot that children can often sort of not get the support they need because there's been a breakdown in the relationship between parent and school. And I'm really hearing from the Slido that, you know, that's probably really difficult for some of you here on the call, trying to get school to really understand and listen and know what's going on for your child and have the time to hear what are your concerns. So really this slide's about encouraging you to keep those communication lines open. If there's a homeschool communication book, do try and use that. If it's really hard to get contact with school staff, then maybe ask, even in reception, what's the best way to communicate with this teacher? How are they best able to hear what I need to share with them? And if you raise difficulties, then we always say, think about the best time to do it. So when our emotions are really strong, sometimes our emotions actually get in the way of us communicating clearly what we want. So we use this phrase, strike when the iron is cold, which means wait until your emotions are cooled down. Also find out when there's a good time to speak to the member of staff, or the best option of a time to speak, so that you can actually go in when they have time to listen and you can communicate in a calm, clear way about what are the things that are going on and how can you together think about how can you improve a situation. Using collaborative language, that comment is really about the fact that it can be very easy for us to say things like, you don't do this in school, and that can immediately sound quite blaming. And maybe there are some strong feelings around where you're coming from, but in terms of helping good communication, it can be helpful to sort of recognize that you're all working together to help support your child. So using that we can be a really helpful way of just supporting, again, positive communication. We've got on this slide a couple of links to things that might be helpful. So Sendias, as we were mentioning throughout this workshop, are an amazing resource of information, and they also sort of give us information to schools as well as to parents and carers. So we've got a link here to guide that way, because Senkos also have a support line, so they can get additional support. And as you've already heard about, special education services and other support that's available for schools is out there. So if your schools are struggling, remind them that there are resources for them, and feel free to share the resources we share with you with your school, so that they can feel better able and resourced to support your child. And there's also a link here, which is a schools development program, which is another series of workshops that we offer, that schools can access the pre-records to help them in supporting the students in their care. There are different resources that can help schools to hear your voice in education. I guess what's really important on this slide, I'm not going to talk about all the information on it just now, but I think what's really important is that schools are expected to hear the child's voice. So as parents and carers, we can actively advocate for our child, but schools also need to hear your child's voice. And actually, that's really good news that they do need to hear that. And they're expected to, and there are requirements around them doing that. And so there are different ways in which gathering information about your child's voice and what they need. There are different sort of worksheets that can be helpful. So I've got some information on this page. And again, there's a link to Sendias. Different ways in which you can find out what your child wants and needs. And I've also included another resource, which is just a nice sort of one-page image that can help your child have a think about what's important for them. Maybe what are their strengths? What do they want in the future? What could they do with help with? So you can use all sorts of different ideas, and you as parents and carers may be incredibly creative in thinking about actually the best way for schools or even yourself to try and get that information from your child. And it could be that they're writing, it could be that they're doing drawings, but it's really important to have your child's voice. And you are likely to know a lot about that voice, but schools need to hear it directly. So there's resources available, and again, links here to share how you can access those resources to help hear about. So what matters to your child, what do they want, and what's going to help them get to where they want in the future. We don't have time to listen to the recording, but we've just got a really nice quote from one young person when they talked about what was helpful in supporting them when they're in education. One thing that really helped me, she says, to adjust to the environment and the constant change in school was a mentor who was also my maths teacher. I found I was able to open up to her and add coping mechanisms to the toolkit for managing in the school environment and when needed homework. So, and I guess this is again a reminder, everyone needs something different, but it doesn't always need to be, you know, lots and lots of different things. That one key person in school sounded like they were fundamental to supporting a young person to learn how to manage and adjust and make school work for them. So that's really great to hear how that worked. So it's about finding the right support, of course, isn't it? And not automatically throwing everything at someone. That can actually be less helpful. Okay. So we've talked a little bit about how you can build, it could be a one-page profile on your child, a way of trying to highlight your child's key needs and what can be helpful to support their needs. So again, there's a range of documents out there, and we've got a couple more links, but this one-page profile on the right is just helpful. It's sort of a shorthand, isn't it? Having a lot of information all on one page that can be shared with key staff. And of course, we know there will be big differences whether you've got children in a primary age or high school age in terms of that ability to communicate effectively what your child needs in that environment, given the variety of different teaching staff that your child has exposure to, which is likely to increase dramatically as they increase in age. So this slide just has a great range of things for you to think about. It's a way of capturing your child's needs by pulling things all together. So let's just think about each of those in turn. And some of these may feel very relevant to you, some will be totally irrelevant. Let's have a quick look through. So clocks and timers, they can be helpful to keep your child on focus, help them to manage time. So that's helpful for some young people. We've talked about the adjustments and the extra time that might be needed for exams and tests. So that might be something you'd be putting in that one-page passport, where the sensory differences, and a number of you highlighted, I know in the Slido, that your child experiences some challenges in that area of difference, then it could be helpful to think about actually wearing independent ear defenders or a sort of loop type earbuds, what might be helpful and what can get agreed within school for them to be using in that domain. Being mindful of the sort of pencil or pen grip types of things, which may be really important to help your child manage their writing. Thinking about other technology, as was described today, about helping to also communicate what is a child trying to express, if that's not always so readily, easily readable. We've talked about incorporating your students' areas of interest to encourage engagement and focus, as that can be especially important when learning feels really hard. Having things like other sensory toys, wobble cushions, that can be really helpful for many young people who fit within a neurodivergent sort of area. They really find that visual things can be really helpful, and I'm a real visual sort of person. I find it so helpful to see things laid out visually in front of me. So reminding the key people in school where that can really make a difference to young person, organising and seeing and making sense of things. Making sure there's written instructions as well as verbal. And again, I think some ideas along those lines were mentioned in the Slido earlier. Breaking down instructions. So this cognitive load, Zoe was talking about being overwhelmed with too much information. And if we can try and break down instructions to one thing at a time, that can help a young person be much more likely to complete that task, then come to having the next instruction and complete that task, and then the next instruction again. So breaking it down into smaller steps. Reducing challenging work, so just being realistic about what's possible for a young person. Does the young person need brain breaks? And again, we were hearing about brain breaks. We're also hearing about movement breaks, and movement breaks can be really important for helping to regulate emotions when either the young person's sort of emotional arousal is quite low, or even if it's quite high, movement can really help their arousal get into that sort of ideal level emotionally again. Do they need support with turn taking? Does your child respond to having choices? Maybe need to be given 2 or 3 good options to choose from, but they still have a sense of control because they are choosing one of those for themselves rather than being told what to do. Sometimes people benefit from a work contract. And communication cards, they can be really helpful for many young people. Some might just link into things like a card so that they've got a toilet pass, or a card to show the teacher that they're struggling. Or it might not be a card, it might be a gesture. But sometimes there can be more specific communication cards that can be helpful. Those visual aids, picture boards or apps. There's a whole range of things out there. And I think it's really, great for you as parents and carers to support something like this pass to help teachers who are often busy and overwhelmed really see all together in one place the key things that you have discovered make a difference to your child. And I guess it's important to recognise that this passport won't be something that once you've done is there forever, because your child is developing and their brain is developing. What they can do will change. So these things may need adaptation over time. And so we would encourage you to review these things, sort of at least every year, to try and think about actually what's needed for my child now. Are the things that they will actually be able to manage to do with support that they couldn't before? And I guess part of our aim as parents is to support our children to become independent and more ready, able, as they grow towards adulthood, to manage in the adult world. So alongside these important adjustments that we need to think about, it's also really important to get that balance and also think about how can we help support them to build their resilience. What are the areas where they will manage a bit more, that they can be pushed to be very slightly uncomfortable, to realise they can tolerate that anxiety, and then a little bit more, because some of those things that we do to support our children now will also help them better manage and be prepared for their world as an adult. A little slide on transitions. So thinking about transitions, transitions can be all sorts, not just transitioning between school, but there are lots of transitions in the school day between classes, moving in corridors. So adjustments around transitions can be really helpful. Where there's a key member of school staff that's not there one day, that can be really tough for your child, and you'll be aware of those things. So some of the things to think about might be about those phased transitions, trying to support school to gradually introduce new things over time rather than it feeling sudden. Meeting key members of staff in advance, or introducing yourself and arranging to meet the class teacher as a parent can be really helpful to help have those discussions around transition. Sometimes people find transition workbooks can be really helpful to try and help support a young person to visualize the differences between different settings. You might want to ask a new school to provide photos of the school to help your young person to have a bit more of a sense of it in advance before they move there. Other transitions that are very common is supporting a young person to manage between classes, moving through busy corridors, perhaps actually leaving a couple of minutes early before everyone else so that they can get their lunch or get to the next place before they feel overwhelmed. There's lots of different ideas around transition, and again I'll highlight the links that we've got on the bottom here, and on the left of the page is that Suffolk mainstream inclusion framework that Sarah talked about right at the beginning. There's a specific page and a link to it, page 13. It says SMIF. That's what we're talking about there, which will help you find out more about ideas to support children with managing transition. This one I don't want to miss. I'd really love you to be able to share with everyone what are some of the things that you have found really helpful. So there might be the adjustments, it might be particular resources that you can share with each other just now when you think about supporting your child's education. So it could be adjustments, it could be a particular tool, it could be having a particular teacher offering a specific role that just felt very helpful for your child. So please have a think and do share what's really made the difference to supporting your child's education, because these are top tips that you can share with each other. That's often the best way of learning, isn't it? Through other people that have had experiences that will never be the same as each other's, but along similar lines of those challenges around trying to support your child with their differences to still access what they need for a positive experience in an education environment. Okay, so what I'm seeing, the first few comments are really all around that relationship, keeping the communication lines open. So well done to those of you who managed to do that. I know it can be really hard sometimes, and I'm seeing some more positive relationships with teachers, having a consistent teacher, of course, so that they really gain understanding of the child. Professional reports with recommendations to back up what we've been asking for. Yes, I think that's great. If you have got reports, or sometimes teachers and schools get reports, shorter reports about things, but actually they don't always have the capacity to keep holding in all that information in mind. So if you have those copies, you can help remind teaching staff about that. Regular catch-ups, even if there's no immediate need. So just keeping people up to date, that sounds really helpful. ND advisor school visit was a game changer. Brilliant, that's great news. Doing Thrive sessions. So those are those sort of normally one-to-one sessions, but perhaps they're in a group in school. So a separate time for your young person to have some support once or twice a week and a quick check-in with a TA. Great. So again, that's a lot around communication, isn't it? Nurture groups. Yes, lots of schools provide nurture groups, and sometimes it needs a parent to highlight. That might be of benefit. I've just missed a few, Zoe, if you could look at any of the lower Slidos, they just suddenly jumped off the screen. Understanding, listening, practical help. Yes, especially while homeschooled. Yeah, having a support worker. Photos of new environments. Thank you. Contact person to know. Yes, that key person.
It doesn't let me scroll down, I'm afraid, Linda. I
Okay.
think because you're in control.
Okay, that's fine. Routines and more routines, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, not feeling like a difficult parent. Yeah, really tough, isn't it? When that's how that's how you can be made to feel, or even if people aren't realizing that's what it's leading to for you. I'm just going to look at those others. I just wanted to check there was nothing that major that I missed. Family support worker, yeah. It's having lots of different ideas around support. Thank you so much for sharing, and you will be able to have access to all of those. And actually, if you're on a phone, you will also just be able to scroll down at all of those different ideas. So just I'm really aware of the time, and actually we're coming to the end of our session, and there's a few more things to share. I have got resources. I will carry on. If you need to leave, you obviously will be given a recording of these. But these are some of the top tips that a specialist teacher in a secondary provision, a specialist secondary provision suggested is really important. And yeah, you've mentioned some of those things. Reducing the cognitive load and slowing things down. We talked about this. Having a routine can really help a child. That actually in itself reduces the cognitive load because they don't have to think too much with a routine. They know what to expect. This also helps with managing anxiety. It gives them a sense of control. So that can be really important. Encouraging your child's strengths will really help them to feel good about themselves, and that builds their self-esteem. Again, something we've mentioned. Redefining success. Again, we've talked about that today. Changing expectations can have a big impact on the pressure that your child might feel, or even that they may put themselves under. Being aware of the goals that your child has for their future isn't about putting pressure on them in this context, but rather understanding where they want to get to in 10 years or 5 years or 2 years, so you can support them to move towards that goal. And having that sense of what's their motivation can help you as parents walk this tricky line between protecting your child and also encouraging them to step out in those hard situations to support their greater independence. And we know that autistic and ADHD children are more likely to thrive in inclusive and supportive environments. So do encourage your school to try and create that neuro-affirming learning environment which celebrates strengths and promotes inclusivity, which we've talked about quite a lot today. So supporting attendance. If there are attendance issues, then things to bear in mind is noticing patterns of avoidance in school, and knowing if there's any factors beneath the surface, remembering what Zoe talked about to do with that iceberg and what behaviour you're seeing on top. They're not attending. What are the reasons why that? What's going on underneath for your child? Is it things that are happening for them? Or is it things that are happening in their environment, such as things that are happening at home and in the family? There are from time to time family worries, other issues that might be impacting your child. It's helpful to be aware of those things. Remember to use the adjustments and those breakout spaces, opportunities that your child might need at timeout cards, lesson breaks, all those things to help think about what can help make school feel easier for them and therefore improve their attendance. We will always talk about creating opportunities for praise, but also recognizing where things are feeling too tough. Might need to think about that reduced or part-time timetable. And I guess at this point we recognise that there are things where things are feeling really difficult, where you might get caught up with having contact with the attendance officer, the education welfare officer. And I guess what's really important there, and what they very much clearly said to us, is, keep the communication lines open with them, because that will be really helpful for you to try and do and prove the things that they're asking you to do, because that will help them understand more about what's going on for you, and they're more interested in supporting your child to attend or get the support they need to manage in education than they are threatening prosecution. So if you can try and keep that engagement even when it's really hard, that is actually the key thing, because really prosecution is the last resort for them. So but they do need you to evidence doing the steps that they are asked to do, in order to see that you're doing everything you need to support your child. Okay, this is a bit of a whistle stop at the tour at the end, I'm realising, and I don't want to do it an injustice. We have got another resource that you might find helpful when you're thinking about looking at your child's attendance and what things might need to be different. So there's a really nice resource there that we can see. And we've also got a slide here I'll talk to only briefly, which is around alternative provision. So alternative provision is used where, for a variety of reasons, a more flexible approach to the education environment is needed for a pupil for a period of time. It often is a short-term offer that's available to pupils that is more pupil-centred and flexible, and maybe uses a whole variety of approaches to enable a child to reintegrate back into education. They might have opportunities to learn a bit more about positive relationships, building resilience, emotional well-being, all as part of that. But so alternative provision is available where students are really struggling in school, but it's very clear sort of guidance about that. You have to be formally referred by a school or Suffolk County Council or by a family service coordinator for this, but it tends to be children that are either at risk of exclusion, might have a link into a part-time timetable being in alternative provision, where they might manage better to help support them a bit more. It might be when a child is permanently excluded and they haven't yet got an alternative regular provision set up, an alternative education provision, or it might be where a school is struggling to meet a young person's needs and they need some targeted or specific support. So again, there's a link here. Likewise, there's an alternative tuition service, and that is available. It's said to be available by schools where a young person is missed up to 15 days consecutively of schools because of sickness, or it can be cumulatively as well. And that's where there is an alternative tuition service. But again, there are some rules around that. But it's something that if you find that your child is really struggling, then they might benefit from having access to that if they're not getting into school. There is also provision post 16. We won't have time to talk about it now, but here are some links here and some information about different services. Some post 16 provision is specifically for young people with EHCPs, but there are also other provisions that don't require this. And just as we're finishing, we'd like to leave you with a couple of key things, and then we've got resources that we will share and send to you. This is a real encouragement from a father of a young person who's linked into our service, a colleague in our service, and he says this: I'm a father to a 15-year-old girl with autism who has attended school part-time for a number of years. She's recently commenced a part-time job in a restaurant, and it's been truly amazing to see her grow in confidence and be recognised and appreciated for the amazing person she is. Perhaps attending school full-time isn't for everyone, nor should it hinder their future opportunities. And I guess that is a real encouragement, I think, because we get used to the fact that we can have the mentality, and not everyone does, but some of us can have a mentality that we have to move down this sort of prescribed, very set route, and everybody has to do that. Whereas we know that everyone is different, and not every route is right for everyone. And it doesn't mean that they won't have the opportunities to develop and progress in the way that they need to. This slide I won't really talk to, I'll let you have a look at it, but this is feedback from parents sharing messages they had from other parents, and we wanted to share some of those messages with you. Okay, and we've lastly just got a few resources that I'll just briefly go through. Some advice and guidance service support. So again, with Sendias that's been talked about throughout, here's the link there to them. Got some key resources. If you're worried about your young person and their well-being, then this slide particularly talks to that. There's a parent helpline that you could use. Schools have school and school nurse and pastoral support. There's an online counselling service. And if there's more serious worries, then there's some information on this slide about how you access support through that. Our next neurodiversity workshop next month is specifically supporting your child on anxiety. So you might want to book your place on that. And next year, from after Christmas, we'll be covering the topics on this slide here in this series. There's a whole range of information around other workshops you might want to access. On the left, through the Psychology in Schools team, that's who we are. And on the right, Sendias, again, who we're highlighting a lot. So they're an independent service for parents and carers around education. They do a lot of specific information. They've got a whole events calendar of other things that they offer. So that information is there too. And lastly, we've got some specific local resources, information around that. What we discussed, support is needs-led and not diagnosis-led, if that's something you need to be armed with to help get your child the support they need. Some other information about other areas we've talked about on this slide with links to each.